Illinois human remains found, the body without a name. A mystery buried since 1966, Ronald Joseph Cole. For nearly 60 years, a body lay without a name. No family notified. No grave marked with certainty. No answers. In 1966, skeletal remains were discovered and cataloged under a case number. Nothing more. At the time, investigators did what they could with the tools they had. The case slowly faded from public view, becoming another quiet entry in America's growing list of unresolved mysteries. But this week, everything changed. Using modern DNA technology, authorities identified the remains as Ronald Joseph Cole, a name that would suddenly reopen not just one cold case, but a chain of troubling connections spanning decades. In this episode, we tell the story of who Ronald Joseph Cole was, how his identity was lost for nearly 60 years, and why this discovery is forcing investigators to re-examine multiple crimes once thought unrelated. This is not just a cold case solved. It's a reminder that the past never truly disappears. In 1966, workers made a grim discovery. Skeletal remains located in a remote area. The condition of the remains suggested the individual had been deceased for a significant period of time. At the time, DNA testing did not exist. Missing persons databases were limited. Interstate coordination was minimal. Investigators relied on dental records, personal effects, and local missing person reports. None provided a match. With no identification possible, the remains were logged as unidentified. And slowly, the case went cold. For decades, Ronald Joseph Cole existed only as an unknown file. No confirmed background. No confirmed last known movements. No confirmed connections. But unidentified does not mean unimportant. Across the United States, thousands of families lived with unanswered questions, never knowing whether their missing loved ones were alive, deceased, or somewhere in between. What no one knew then was that technology would one day catch up to this silence. Fast forward to the present. Advances in forensic genealogy have transformed cold case investigations. By analyzing preserved biological material, investigators can now extract genetic profiles, compare them against public genealogy databases, identify family connections once impossible to trace. In this case, scientists re-examined the 1966 remains using modern DNA analysis. The result was immediate and staggering. The remains belonged to Ronald Joseph Cole. A name, a history, and a past that would raise serious questions. Why this identification matters. Once identified, investigators began examining Cole's background. What they found was concerning. Records linked his name to earlier abuse allegations, suspected involvement in violent incidents, connections to cases from the 1980s and early 2000s. Importantly, these findings do not constitute legal conclusions. They are investigative connections under renewed review. But they were enough to change everything. Identifying Ronald Joseph Cole did not close a case. It opened several. Because once his name resurfaced, investigators began asking a dangerous question. If this man was unidentified for decades, how many cases were connected without anyone realizing it? First comes confirmation, DNA verification, family lineage analysis, cross-checking historical records. Once identity is confirmed, investigators ask a critical question. Who was this person in life? That question matters because identity gives context. Where they lived, who they interacted with, and whether their name appears elsewhere in investigative records. In the case of Ronald Joseph Cole, that context raised immediate concern. As investigators reviewed public records, court documents, and historical reports, they found that Cole's name had surfaced before, long after his disappearance. These records included Allegations of abusive behavior. Suspected involvement in violent incidents. Mentions in cases investigated during the 1980s and early 2000s. It's important to be precise here. These records do not represent convictions related to the 1966 remains. They represent patterns of concern that investigators are now reevaluating. What stood out was not a single accusation, but repetition. The pattern analysis in cold cases. Modern cold case investigations rely heavily on pattern analysis. Investigators look for behavioral similarities, geographic overlap, timelines that align across cases. In this situation, researchers began comparing the time period surrounding the 1966 discovery, Cole's documented movements, later cases involving abuse or suspected violence. What they noticed was unsettling. Certain behaviors appeared consistent across decades. This doesn't prove guilt, but it does justify deeper investigation. Why these connections were missed. To understand why these links weren't identified earlier, we need to understand the limitations of the past. In the 1960s through early 2000s, records were paper-based. Databases were not centralized. Interstate information sharing was limited. DNA technology was either primitive or unavailable. Cases were often investigated in isolation. If a person moved frequently, changed jobs, or crossed jurisdictions, patterns could vanish. Ronald Joseph Cole's unidentified status meant his name couldn't be flagged. His history couldn't be connected. His movements couldn't be tracked. Without a name, there was no anchor. Today, investigators work differently. Advanced tools allow them to overlay decades of data, compare behavioral patterns across time, identify consistencies invisible to earlier investigators. Forensic genealogy, digital archiving, and data analytics now make it possible to ask questions that once had no answers. And while technology doesn't guarantee resolution, it changes one critical thing. It removes anonymity. Ronald Joseph Cole is no longer an unknown, and that alone reshapes every case connected to his name. Who was Ronald Joseph Cole? Ronald Joseph Cole was a 19-year-old man from Fillmore, California, who disappeared in 1965. His disappearance was reported in 1983, although he had not been seen since 1965. On October 27, 1966, a human skull and skeletal remains were found near a creek southeast of Geneseo in Henry County, Illinois. The FBI later determined that the skull had a bullet hole at the base, indicating a homicide death. In 2024, the Henry County Sheriff's Office partnered with the DNA Doe Project to generate a DNA profile from Cole's remains. By comparing that profile with genetic genealogy databases, investigators confirmed the remains belonged to Ronald Joe Cole. Investigators confirmed that Cole disappeared in California in 1965 at age 19. His skeletal remains were found in Illinois in 1966 and were identified in 2026. The cause of death was determined to be a gunshot wound. These elements are documented facts based on forensic analysis and investigative records. Who was the suspect linked? Investigators on and off over the years have flagged some troubling associations, important context, but not legal conclusions. The half-brother as a person of interest. Ronald Cole was reportedly living with his half-brother, David Lefevre, at the time he vanished. Lefevre was named as the prime suspect in Cole's disappearance and presumed death. In 1983, Lefevre and his wife Margaret Skaggs were arrested on unrelated child abuse charges in Arizona. Family accounts and some documents indicate Lefevre may have confessed to killing his brother, though there was never enough physical evidence to prosecute. Other cases that were tied. Investigators and community records have noted that Lefevre was also considered a suspect in the disappearance and death of John Bryan Skaggs, Margaret's brother, who went missing in 1977 and whose remains were found near the Lefevre's former home in 1984. Neither Lefevre nor anyone else was formally charged in those matters, and Lefevre died in 2007 in Alaska. These associations are part of investigative discussion. They do not equate to convictions related to Ronald Cole's death. What is the current investigation status? As of 2026, the case is classified as a homicide investigation under the jurisdiction of the Henry County Sheriff's Office, with cooperation from Ventura County authorities in California. Law enforcement encourages anyone with information to come forward. There is a common misconception about cold cases, that if no one can be prosecuted, the work no longer matters. Investigators strongly disagree. Identification matters because it restores identity and dignity, allows families to learn the truth, reframes unresolved investigations, creates historical clarity. In this case, the identification of Ronald Joseph Cole did something critical. It connected a decades-old discovery to a documented life history, and that history raised difficult questions. In many cold cases, the passage of time eliminates legal outcomes. Witnesses pass away. Evidence degrades. Statutes of limitation apply. This case appears to fall into that category. But justice does not exist only in courtrooms. For families, justice can mean knowing what happened, understanding the circumstances, having uncertainty replaced with truth. For investigators, justice can mean correcting the historical record, closing misclassified cases, identifying patterns to prevent future harm. Even when arrests are impossible, answers still matter. This case is not unique. Across the United States, hundreds of unidentified remains cases from the mid-20th century are now being reopened. What's changed is not the evidence, it's the technology. Cases once considered unsolvable are being re-examined with fresh eyes. And each identification sends a message. Time does not erase responsibility. It's essential to be responsible in how these cases are discussed. The renewed attention surrounding Ronald Joseph Cole does not equal a legal verdict. It represents investigative reassessment. Researchers and investigators are careful to focus on documented behaviors, verified timelines, consistent patterns. Pattern recognition is not about blame. It's about understanding risk factors and preventing future harm. Cold cases teach us not just what happened, but what was missed. What do families wait for? Behind every cold case is someone waiting. Waiting for a phone call, a name, an explanation. Families of unidentified individuals often live in a unique form of uncertainty. They don't know whether to grieve. They don't know whether to hope. Identification ends that limbo. Even when the truth is painful, clarity can be healing. In this case, the name Ronald Joseph Cole returned from history, not as a mystery, but as a person whose life and death now have context. Why this case resonates today? This story resonates because it represents a turning point. It shows that cold cases are not forgotten. Technology can rewrite investigative timelines. Accountability evolves over time. It also reminds us that justice is not always immediate. Truth is not always dramatic. Closure is sometimes quiet. Sometimes, the most powerful moment in a case isn't an arrest. It's a name being spoken after decades of silence. Cold cases do not ask for spectacle. They ask for patience. They wait for better tools, better questions, better understanding. The identification of Ronald Joseph Cole is not the end of this story. It is proof that the past is not beyond reach. And as technology continues to advance, more names will return from anonymity. More families will get answers. and more stories once buried will finally be told. If you value in-depth, responsible true crime storytelling, stories that prioritize facts, patterns, and respect over speculation, consider subscribing to this channel, True Crime Narratives. Because cold cases are not just about the past, they are about what we choose to remember. And sometimes, remembering is the first step toward justice.